anyway, what do we have today, Lucy? Oh, congratulations on your new show.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Baka hindi nanonood nung Sabado, di ba? Nung Sabado.
Sabado, alas 9. Yes. So,
it's a URL.
Conception.
At si Lucy Cusuales.
Yeah. Pero hindi yan ang balita ngayon. Wag mong lisin. Okay, huwag tayo lumis. Doon tayo sa nagaganap na ngayon ang meeting ng IATF on the new classifications, I would imagine, right? On
whether we extend or we modify the modified ECQ.
Yes.
or do we make it stricter or more looser? Sabi nga nila, baka dapat may bagong term na MMGCQ. Mas mahigpit na GCQ. It does get confusing already.
I know. Hindi, tsaka yung proof of life ni President Duterte, 'di ba? Sure na may dyaryo na naman si Honey.
May bulletin.
So, at saka si Bongo, nagsabi si Senator Bongo to say na hindi dito sila buhay na buhay. Pero kasi nakaka-intriga yung sinabi ni Harry Roque na perpetual isolation.
Although nag-contextualize man siya later on. Pero kasi, di ba, sometimes talaga the choice of words really matter. Well, not really sometimes. Actually, most of the time, when you're in the pulpit of public office, every word matters.
Yes, that's true.
So when you say perpetual
isolation, parang forever siyang may sakit or may antibody or positive or
kumbaga sa Latin
quarantine.
Sa Latin in secula seculorum, forever and ever.
Forever and ever. Ay, nako.
Which is what perpetual is. Not unless you're talking about the idiom na, I am perpetually broke, which means that I'm always broke. Ganon.
Yeah.
So medyo, may hyperbole yun, syempre. But then again, when you speak at the pulpit of public office, it's a different matter altogether.
At saka layo naman nun dun sa 6 feet away from the nearest cabinet member during the meetings. Kasi isolation.
But that's supposed to apply to all of us. So in effect, all of us are on perpetual isolation.
Yes. Anyway, ano pa ba? Well, dumating yung mga victims ng Beirut blast at naiyak si Secretary Teddy Locsin, diba? I mean, he was moved to tears. Nakakaiyak naman talaga rin.
There's Robbie Lampay from Mandaluyong. Robbie, anong big story?
Magandang gabi po. Well, yun pa rin. We're still, obviously, we're monitoring. May address ngayon ng mabilis si President Duterte. I don't know if we already discussed that. Pinost nga ni Senator Bongo.
Yes.
Of course. But very brief message. Simple lang. Just reminding people ng wear your masks and so on. And then the second part of the statement is basically just a categorical statement na nandito lang ako sa Pilipinas.
Right. Yeah. Andiyan lang siya. Intrigero kasi kayo eh.
Sino kayo?
No,
Ikaw nag-bring up hindi naman kami.
Ayan o.
The president is glaring at the photographer.
Yeah. Well, kasi naman si Secretary Anyo, no? Ano ba yun?
Positive ulit.
So, parang you don't really get immune, no? I don't know. How do you...
Apparently not. Apparently. And then again, kasi also, and I guess tonight, the first guest tonight is going to talk about this kasi there's also a new strain that has come up. And walang guarantee naman kasi that if you're immune from one strain, you're immune from all the other strains. Maybe not. It all depends on what the strain is and how different the strain is from the others. Yeah. Oh, naghang si Lucy. Anyway, siguro let's bring in our guests already. Let's bring in our guests already. We're talking to research associate and senior bioinformatics specialist of the Philippine Genome Center, Mr. Francis Tablizo. Mr. Tablizo, are you there? Can you? He's coming online. Hi, sir.
Hi, sir.
Magandang gabi po.
Magandang gabi po.
Sir, well, alam ko po na mahilig kayong padugoy ng mga ilong namin, and that seems to be a common trait among scientists and mathematicians. But more or less in layman's terms, in terms that people can generally understand, we understand that you have found a relatively new strain of the coronavirus. We're now calling it G614 as differentiated from the original D614. Siyempre, ang pinaka-concern ng maraming tao ngayon is, number one, how different is it? And number two, is it more dangerous than the original?
Okay po. Mag-i-issue lang po ako ng clarifications on, una po, yung virus po is already circulating since March. No? Nauna siyang napunta sa Europe, so nagsisirculate na siya. So
sir, you're talking about the second virus, tama ba?
No,
you're talking about the second virus, yung G614.
Yung G strain.
Yeah. Kasi yung original is D for dog. The new one is, the relatively new one is G for golf, G614. Sige sir, so you're talking about the second one, G614 already circulating as of March. Sige po, go ahead.
So the G614 was first detected na around March. Nauna siya pong mag-circulate sa Europe. Pero po hindi po siya pumasok agad dito sa Pilipinas. So what we're saying is ngayon lang siya na-detect dito sa Pilipinas. Opo, pero hindi po siya talaga super novel na dito lang nakita. Clarification. And then yung second po is yung G614 po na variant, kaya po siya naging parang nag-stood out among all the other mutations doon sa SARS-CoV-2 kasi marami pong changes.
There are other mutations pa?
Yes, opo. Normal po sa mga viruses lagi po silang mag-mutate talaga. So, pero among other mutations, kaya po siya nag-stood out kasi po yung G614, initially po kasi yung galing China, parang ang nakikita nila laging D614. Pero eventually, worldwide, parang mas naging, mas kumalat na G614. So kaya po parang binabantayan din po siya ng mga scientists. Yung second po na special sa kanya is, nag-occur po siya sa isang protein dun sa virus na involved dun sa interaction sa human cells. So para makapasok yung virus sa human cells, kailangan yung protein na yun. So nandun siya sa protein na yun. Pero hindi siya directly involved dun sa interaction. Nandun lang siya sa protein na involved sa interaction. So,
So
pero magkaiba ba yung sintomas niya? Iba ba yung sintomas na dinudulot niya?
Opo, yun po yung third po na clarification na gusto namin i-issue. Kasi parang yung mga news reports po, parang sinabi nila na mas nakakahawa, mas infective, mas mataas yung rate of transmission. Pero po, yung wala pong definitive na evidence sa ngayon na mas mataas talaga yung rate of transmission nitong G614 na variant. And yung pong pwede po nating masabi na hindi rin siya mas nagiging malala yung mga kaso ng G614. So at least yun po medyo makakahinga tayo doon.
Okay, so anong diferensya? Yun lang protein? Yun lang?
Meron pong isang protein, yun po yung, ang tawag po nila doon, spike protein ng virus, no? So, yung spike protein po, nandun po siya sa surface ng virus, tapos siya po yung nag-a-attach sa human cells. So, pinabantayan po kasi mga changes dito, kasi po yung changes sa spike protein, pwedeng mag-iba yung way na kung paano pumapasok yung virus sa cell. So, pwedeng mas maging effective, pwedeng mas maging less effective.
Mr. Tablizo, yung next question ko therefore is, kung nagbabago yung itong strain na ito, does that affect the research for finding a vaccine? Back to zero ba? May bagong strain or not necessarily?
Yeah. Hindi po ako yung talagang dito, expert. Pero ang masasabi ko po is, based on how yung mga clinical trials are proceeding right now. And alam natin na March pa lang na-detect na tong mutation na to, no? So yung actual effect ng mutation na to dun sa vaccine discovery process, hindi ganun kalaki. Kasi parang tuloy-tuloy pa rin yung proseso kahit na-detect na siya dati pa. So,
okay. Pero itong
sir,
strain na ito, nakita nyo lang sa Quezon City, no? Ipagpapatuloy nyo ba ang pag-detect nun sa iba pang lugar sa Metro Manila?
Opo. Hopefully, pag na-release na po yung yung funding namin, kasi medyo mahal din po yung research, yung ganitong klaseng research. So hopefully, once nandiyan na yung funds, mas malawak na po yung pag-survey dun sa mga mutations na hindi lang po yung D614G. Meron pa pong mga ibang mutations na binabantayan din po tayo.
Okay. Pero ang ibig sabihin ba nito, magbabago yung mga protocols? Magkakaroon ba ng mark? Kailangan bang mag-adjust behavior-wise and even cure-wise, no? Treatment-wise? Meron bang mga kailangan baguhin kung sakaling makita nga na mas malawak pala yung G-strain?
Sa ngayon po hindi pa po ganun kalaki talaga yung epekto niya, no. So hindi naman po magiging masyadong malaki yung effect niya kasi yung clinical outcomes po ng G614 medyo pareho lang dun sa dati yung D614. So at least in terms of yung sa hospitals, pwede pa rin po nila ipagpatuloy kung ano po yung mga ginagawa nila. Opo, yun po.
Sir, yung paglilinaw nyo kanina na there is no evidence yet telling us whether or not it's more infectious than the D614. We understand po, what you really need, siyempre, to begin with, is scientific evidence to back up any assertion. But I'm just wondering po, saan lang galing yung kumalat na mga balita na it might be more infectious because of the different spike protein that supposedly that some people appear to have said makes it easier for the virus to attach to a human cell. I'm wondering lang po kung saan galing yun. Is that really a possibility or is that just talagang out of the blue lang?
It's a possibility po kasi po meron pong previous na study ginawa sa ibang bansa na nakita po nila na yung gumamit sila ng tawag po namin dito cell line or cell culture, no? So hindi talaga sa tao tinest. Tapos po gumamit po sila ng pseudoviruses. Ibig sabihin, viruses sila pero minimimic lang nila yung certain characteristics.
Yeah. Hindi siya itong particular na yes. Coronavirus.
Opo, hindi talaga siya yung coronavirus. So basically ang ginawa lang po nila, gumawa sila ng virus na merong spike protein na may D614 variant. Tapos isa pa pong setup na meron ding G614 na variant. Tapos nakita nila na mas mabilis kumalat dun sa cells yung may G614 kesa sa may D614. So mas mabilis silang dumami basically. Pero yun nga po, dahil unang-una hindi ito ginawa sa tao, no? In vitro yung tawag natin doon. No? So sa lab lang, tinest lang sa cell lines, tapos hindi actual SARS-CoV-2 yung tinitignan. So marami pa po mga questions na hindi pa po masagot talaga sa ngayon ng mga scientists. Pero debatable pa po yung hypothesis na mas nagiging infective siya or mas bumibili.
Okay. Point well taken. Ipakilala ko lang po, just coming online is Ana Marie Pamintuan of the Philippine Star, reporting from the port area in Manila. Ami, good evening to you.
Yes, good evening.
Hi, Ami.
Related lang dito sa topic na to. If it's a more virulent strain, if it's a potentially more virulent strain, mas tenacious siya. Mas posible ba na mag-reinfect yung survivor? Kasi people are talking now about Secretary Eduardo Año getting reinfected. No? So kung ganyan katindi ang bagong strain na yan, pwede ba siya na maka-reinfect?
Yung reinfection po, hindi po siya talaga parang nakabase doon sa strain, no? Parang yung isa pong iniisip ng mga scientists kaya nagre-reinfect, noong unang beses po siyang na-infect, hindi siya nag-develop ng ganun kalakas na immune response, no? So nawala agad yung response niya. kaya na-infect po ulit siya. So, in general po, yung transmission is mainly dahil nagkakaroon talaga ng contact with an infected individual rather than mas infective yung
Hindi dahil sa nag-survive ng matagal yung virus. Hindi dahil doon.
So you can be reinfected by the same strain, parang ganon. You can be reinfected by the same strain.
Yeah, may mga ganun.
Depende.
Na dahil po hindi yung immune response, hindi po siya tumatagal sa katawan. So, nare-reinfect. Pero yun po yung goal ng vaccine development na mag-elicit ng malakas enough na immune response na tatagal para mas matagal bago ka ma-infect. Para pong flu,
yung immune response ba, I mean, is the difference big enough that yung immune response to one will be different to the immune response to the other one? Or is it close enough na pagka may immune response ka sa isa, medyo may napakalat?
Sa ngayon po, in terms of yung mga samples po na nakikita worldwide, maliit pa po, hindi pa po ganun kalaki actually yung differences na nakikita, no? Although maraming mga mutations na nakikita, pero sa isang strain or sa isang individual virus, hindi siya ganun karami. So, ibig sabihin, magkakamukha pa rin sila hanggang ngayon. Yun po yung parang idea.
Ngayon kanina nabanggit mo na actually marami ng strains, no? We've been talking about the D614 and G614. Ilan na ba yung na-monitor dito? Itong dalawa pa lang, or are there ilan na of everything that now know from around the world?
Yeah, sa ngayon po, in terms of yung data po kasi na ginagamit namin, ang tawag po dito yung mga genome sequences, no? O yung basically yung ginagawa po namin, yung genetic material, tinatransform siya into parang a series of letters. So yun po yung idea. And yung order ng letters, yung similarity nun, important dun sa virus, no? So sa ngayon, yung order, pag tinignan po yung sequence of letters na yun, malaki pa rin po yung pagkakatulad nila, no? Actually, yung length ng letters na yun, mga around 30,000, and more than 99% similar pa sila. So, most likely, hindi pa po ganun kalaki yung actual changes individually, no? Pero, yun po, kailangan po kasi siyang i-monitor kasi as time passes by, nag-accumulate yung changes na yan sa population. So, gusto po nating makita, paano ba sila nagbabago? Ano yung pinupuntahan nilang territory? And gusto rin natin makita, paano sila nag-spread? So, yun po yung parang idea.
Anong ibig sabihin ng mas parang higher viral load itong G614? Anong ibig sabihin nun? What do you mean by higher viral load?
Yun po yung binabanggit ko kanina na sa mga cell lines, mas marami yung pag tinignan kung gaano karami yung virus na nakapasok dun sa cells, mas marami yung may G614 kaysa sa may D614. So basically, yung amount po niya. So yun kaya po nagkaroon sila ng hypothesis na baka mas infective yung G614. Pero yun po, hindi po siya.
Pero hindi yun ang ibig sabihin nun.
Opo. So walang immune response talaga yung cells, unlike yung complete organism na magre-react pag may pumasok na foreign material sa kanya.
So, sir, you mentioned kanina kasi that there are several strains already existing. How many strains are we talking about, and how many of these strains are significantly different from each other?
In terms of strain, yung strain po medyo loosely siya ginagamit sa ngayon, pero merong mga group of researchers na magsasabi na isang strain lang talaga yung virus kasi magkakamukha pa talaga sila. Pero
very little difference pa lang, bale.
Meron ka nitong G at D na kumakalat. So minsan ginagamit nila yung strain na term for identify the D strain and the G.
Francis, ano ba usually ang mga factors na nakakapag-mutate sa isang virus? Meron ba, halimbawa ba pagka yung may dala ng virus, halimbawa positive ngayon, ay nagkaroon siya ng bacterial infection na iba, nag-mutate ba? Ganun ba yun? What factors actually lead to a mutation?
Okay. So, ayun, magandang tanong po yan. No? So, yung mutation po, naturally, nag-mutate talaga yung virus. No? Pag dumadami sila, nagkakaroon ng mutations. Pero yung nangyayari po is, kung meron kang mutation that confers parang mas napapatibay niya yung virus, mas napapaganda niya yung virus, nag-i-stay yun sa population. No? So, meron din namang virus na, mutations na detrimental dun sa virus, so nawawala yun. So, kaya po, yung mga to, yung mga mutations po na nakikita natin na nagsusurvive sa population, somehow it confers parang resistance siguro to the virus, or it confers some sort of positive effect, no, in terms of yung virus.
Meaning, if it's a stronger mutation, may effect yun dun sa period of immunity. Kasi merong debate on how long, kung sakasakali mang may ma-develop na vaccine, gaano daw katagal yung immunity dun sa virus. May effect ba yan kung if it's a stronger strain?
It depends po on what type of vaccine yung ginagamit, no? Kasi meron pong mga vaccine na kunyari, ang tawag nila attenuated virus. So yung buong virus mo pero hindi na siya infectious talaga. So parang nila yun. Pero meron din pong mga ibang klase ng vaccine, no, na part lang talaga ng virus yung ginagamit. So depende po dun sa type ng vaccine yung mai-elicit niya na response, and kung makaka-affect ba yung particular mutation or hindi sa kanya.
Okay. So teka, may tanong lang ako. Halimbawa, ang bacteria, di ba? Sinasabi nila, huwag kang mag-antibiotic unless prescribed kasi you develop immunity to the medicine. Ito ba? Is it possible na mag-mutate siya, mag-develop siya ng resistance depende sa gamot? I mean, is that something that is also possible, that a mutation that actually ends up making the virus more resistant comes from a medication or treatment that is being used to fight it? Is that possible?
Yeah, it is possible po. No? So kung masyadong madalas ginagamit yung particular na gamot against the virus, it's really possible, no? Pero po ang difference po kasi ng viruses sa bacteria, usually yung viruses po ang hindi po talaga yung virus parang ina-attack ng gamot. Parang ang gusto mo po is i-suppress yung side effects ng virus, yung negative effects ng virus until maka-recover yung immune system ng tao at patay niya yung virus sa katawan niya. So,
talaga yung antibody.
Opo. So mas madalas nangyayari sa bacteria.
Ako, pahabulan ng tanong, medyo existential na kaunti siguro in terms of the virus. Pero kasi yung kabataan ko po, there was a big debate as to whether a virus is a living thing or a non-living thing. Because in effect, it's basically non-living, sabi ng iba, that it's nothing but a replicating machine. So what is it really? Is it an animate object or an inanimate object? Is it living or non-living?
It's still debatable.
It's a ganun ba?
Still debatable.
RNA lang siya. Kailangan niya ng host to replicate. It cannot self-replicate. Diba?
Yeah, it's basically a strand of ribonucleic acid, RNA.
Kailangan po niya ng machinery ng host niya para para dumami siya.
Para mag-survive.
Which is why you cannot really kill a virus. You just destroy it.
Yeah. In a sense, parang basically ganun nga po, no? Kasi kung isipin natin na hindi talaga buhay yung virus, so hindi mo talaga siya mapapatay.
That makes it different completely from bacteria. Bacteria kasi talagang it's an animal Yung bacteria Ang virus is just a strand of RNA. It's a strand of your parang RNA mo, yung it's a building block of life. It is not life.
Kaya kailangan talaga
Anyway,
walang
sorry.
Ribonucleic.
Kaya kailangan
Sorry. Existential question ng virus.
Oo nga eh. Tama na. Yan, hirap sagutin yan.
Okay.
Huwag na yan.
Okay. Maraming salamat si Francis Tablizo,
Thank you,
Senior
Francis.
Bioinformatics Specialist ng Philippine Genome Center. Sir, thank you for joining us tonight.
Salamat din po.
Salamat po. Sana
Sige, ito, existential question.
Naalala ko lang, natutuwa ako kay Mr. Tablizo and every time we get scientists here, natutuwa lang ako kasi naalala ko, nung parang nasa high school tayo at sinasabi ng bio, physics, science teachers natin na magtanong ka kung wala ka naiintindihan, eh, totoo pala yun, dapat pala nagtatanong kayo. Ang dali-dali pa lang magtanong.
Kailangan mo lang pangunahan na, sir, wag nosebleed
Grabe. Kasi naman, pag bata, wala tayong pakialam sa mga virus at bacteria, no? We think we'll live forever, right?
So, yung mga bata, kung nanonood kayo, yung science classes, sinabi na teacher, pag tanong ka, kung di mo naiintindihan, ito po yan. Kaya yun na, magtanong kayo na magtanong, hanggang sinasagot kayo.
Okay. Okay, Mok, we'll just pause for a break, so please stay with us.
Welcome back to the Chiefs. We are now in the final stage of our conversation, and we'd now like to welcome our next guest, members of the UP OCTA Research Team, Father Nicanor Austriaco and Professor Guido David. Welcome back to the Chiefs, Father and Professor.
Good evening. Thank you for having us again.
Yes. Well,
Yes, good evening.
Good
it's another,
Good evening po.
yes.
Good evening.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us again.
Yes, we're waiting again for an announcement from Malacanang, and there seems to be some debates between mayors and, well, as usual, the economists, the health officials, the mayors, we were told, want stricter quarantine. Where does well, in particular, Metro Manila, where do we stand now? And maybe we start with Father Austriaco.
So I'll begin by just talking about the surge. So we experienced a surge at the end of July. And we were at the end of July, the last week of July, we were witnessing about 2,000 cases, new cases of COVID per day in the NCR. And that, of course, is what led to the exhaustion of our medical frontliners who called for the reinstitution of the modified ECQ. And that modified ECQ was put into place August 4th. And we can see, if we look at the data, and I will hand it over to Professor David in a few minutes to talk about the RT, but it's very clear that at the early part of the month, the caseloads began to drop. And the best way to talk about that is to talk about the decreasing reproductive rate. So I'm going to pass that on to my colleague, Professor David.
Okay. Professor.
Yes, thank you, Father Nick. Yes, what Father Nick is saying is the trend is actually decreasing. So that is the good news. If you look at the number of cases, it seems like we're still getting a lot of cases, and it can be actually deceiving. Because when we explain that the trend is decreasing, people always ask, "Paano ganun? We're still seeing 6,000 cases, 4,000 cases." Definitely, it looks like the numbers are still high. Pero we look at different trends, and not just yung reported cases, but also yung test center results and yung returns nila. And we're seeing actually a decrease in trend. This is an actual decrease in trend. Yes, it's actually decreasing the trend, but the reproduction number is decreasing. It doesn't mean, of course, the number of cases is necessarily decreasing. It just means the actual number of cases that we're seeing is less than what we would see if the trend did not decrease. I mean, that seems like common sense. Pero parang ganun siya.
Parang kung the acceleration is going down.
Yes, it's like a deceleration.
Deceleration.
Right. But there's an actual decrease in number of cases. It was averaging 4,000 plus 2 weeks ago. So now we're averaging less than 4,000. So if we look at the number of cases, it actually decreased a little bit, not significantly, because yung effects ng MECQ, normally we will see that 2 to 4 weeks after the implementation. So there's a lag time sa realization of the effect of the quarantine. So this happened in Cebu. Once we hammered down ECQ sa Cebu, after 2 weeks yung trend, it was decreasing, pero it seems like yung number of cases was still high. Pero right now, we're seeing Cebu flatten the Talaing curve from 300 down to 90 cases per day, less than 90 cases per day. So that is a big improvement sa Cebu. And yung R0 sa Cebu is
Nawala si Professor.
A point.
Professor.
Father Nick na lang.
Professor David data shows that the RT for Cebu is now around 0.5. And for you to understand what that means, because that means that one person is only capable of infecting half a person. So that means that the number of cases is going to decrease significantly over time. But as Professor David pointed out, this is a gradual thing, and it will take weeks to see, which is why it's so important. And as we pointed out in our report, it's really important for us not to lose the momentum of the MECQ.
Okay, so let's get
Father, that's Cebu.
Because that's the big question now for people. Everybody called for a timeout. 2 weeks was actually a compromise. In the doctor's it was actually a compromise. But now we're at the end of those 2 weeks. So for the momentum that you say is very important, what would you recommend?
So I think, a couple of things. First of all, it's important to recognize that 12 of the LGUs in Manila still have critical numbers of hospital beds occupied, above 70%. So even though the numbers are trending down, the absolute number is still high. And so that the danger we have is that if we loosen up the GCQ without properly making sure that we will not repeat what we did before in the first GCQ, is that these numbers will again begin to rise, because the disease is predictable. If you don't change something, it will do what it did before. And so our team is proposing that an additional 2 weeks will really reinforce the downward trend, and we will end the 2 weeks with substantially lower number of cases than we would today, because a 2-week period is a single viral incubation time. And so you give the community in Manila an additional 2 weeks to allow viruses to die, really, without spreading to new patients.
Okay. So another 2 weeks will give you an actual dip in the absolute number of cases, not just the R0.
Well, we saw in Cebu that a 4-week period would lead to a halving of the absolute cases. So if we're going to stay, and again, it's so hard to compare two different urban areas because there are very different demographics in play. Nonetheless, you're seeing that it was a quarter drop in 2 weeks, a half drop in a month. And so the hope here is that if we started off with around 1,500 per day on average, which is what we were seeing around the beginning of August, the hope is if we maintain it for another 2 weeks, we will drop below that 1,000, and that's a very strong position to begin the GCQ again.
But we're so far from that because the average now is still at 3,000 something. Is that something doable within the next 2 weeks, granting that the MECQ will be extended?
So keep in mind that 3,000 is spread out over many days. So the way that the DOH reports its numbers is that it's 3,000 reported today, but it was not for just today. It's for a few days. So what you do, if you look at the graphs, just at the beginning of the month, which is where our data is most solid, because in the last week the data is still changing rapidly. So you have to go a couple, 10 days before. It's about 1,500 on average per day, and that's a stable number. And so that's what we hope to push down even further. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague to continue.
Yes. Okay. Yes, Guido, you also said in an interview that it will depend on the strategies, that that the government will be adopting. What would be these strategies?
Well, I mean, this is very important kasi last time we had ECQ and MECQ, the numbers were still low. So NCR, we were only averaging 200 cases per day. Hello?
Yes.
Go ahead.
We hear you.
Yes. Okay. So
Yes.
checking if I'm still okay. So we were averaging 200 cases per day at the end of May, and then when we got the GCQ, the goal was to maintain that. But the numbers got out of hand. Our hospitals got filled up, and that is the main problem here. So what we don't want is when we relax, numbers will again get out of hand, and we will not be able to control. So one approach would be to retain a strict quarantine, but this is not, of course, doable long term. Maybe we can do a 2 weeks or 4 weeks quarantine. But we have to sustain this. So we have to have set up proper interventions. So what we want, for example, if they want, and the government is trying, it's doing some thinking of what to do. So let's say we do localized lockdowns, but these have to be good localized lockdowns. You can't have a localized lockdown that will be around 1 day or 2 day long. I mean, it has to be maybe at least 1 to 2 weeks, 2 weeks for the incubation period. And then you have to increase testing because our positivity rate, as Father would attest, it's very high right now. The Metro Manila is around 16 to 17%. And that's very high. When your positivity rate is that high, it means your testing is not sufficient. Let's say you're not capturing all the COVID positive cases. So it means we have to increase testing even further. Maybe we have to increase it. Because right now we're getting maybe 17 to 19,000 tests per day sa Metro Manila.
Nawala ulit.
I'll just pick up from where Professor Guido was talking. So again, when your positivity rate is around 16, 17%, and I just want to remind you that the World Health Organization is asking for a positivity rate below 10% and ideally below 5%. So we are very far above that. It means two things. One is we're not testing enough, and as Professor Guido David was pointed out, we have to increase capacity. And it's been many months now, and the government is trying very hard to increase capacity, but especially now when there are more cases. So when you have high positivity rate, it means two things. One is we're not testing enough. The second is that there just simply is there are more virus in the community. So we have to be able to identify them quickly in order to isolate and quarantine both patients and possible patients.
Father, I don't know if you could drill down into specific cities and the different experiences, but we know that Navotas was an outlier a few weeks back. Navotas made a very different decision from the rest of NCR. Navotas said, we want a complete lockdown again for the entire city. Do we have numbers now to see that experiment, if we look at Navotas as an experiment, relative to the rest of NCR?
So Navotas is an interesting case because when I was studying the hospitalizations in the Philippines, in Manila, one of the things you discover is that Navotas has only one hospital, and the hospital is relatively small. So they are quickly overwhelmed. In fact, if I remember correctly, they do not even have an ICU unit in the city of Navotas. So they went into hard lockdown precisely because, unlike the other cities like Quezon City, which has many, many beds and excess beds, the Navotas would be overwhelmed, and they were. Now, just looking at my numbers from our most recent report, I cannot quote Navotas to you, but I can tell you it's come down. Now, the difficulty with Navotas is because you have a very small hospital with small hospital capacity. With the extent of the pandemic, it will still be full. You're not going to see significant decreases in the hospitalization of a small hospital for a while if there were just so many patients in the neighborhood.
I want to ask you about the government is now focusing on recoveries, and they recently reported a surge in recoveries, I think about 40,000. How does that figure in your projections?
So I will speak on my behalf, and then I'll hand it to Professor David. But in many modeling cases, when we do modeling, you actually do not necessarily have to take recoveries into account. And what is really striking is that how you define a recovered patient varies throughout the world. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, the Philippines defined a recovered patient as 2 negative RT-PCR tests. Now, the difficulty is we didn't have enough tests, and they were very expensive. So many people did not complete those tests. So technically, even though they were cured, they were healed, they did not pass the test. So if you remember, about a month or so ago, the DOH changed the definition of recovery called test-based to symptoms-based, which you count the number of the days. And that's why you see 40,000. So all of a sudden, people recovered because the definition of recovery have been changed. And I can tell you, this is the primary definition that is used throughout the world because we don't have enough tests.
But based on what you said earlier, that some models actually disregard that, do not factor that in. I mean, how does your model work? Or are you saying that since we don't really have a really reliable even definition of what it is, or even a stable definition of what it is, much less the actual testing to seed that with data, do we just disregard that? Is it safe to just disregard that and let's just concentrate on the other methods?
So remember, I will speak for myself and then I'll hand it to Professor David, but you're most interested in infection. So the idea is once they are not infectious, in a sense, they're not as important for the model, even if they've not recovered. Now, we take into account how many died. So died is, believe it or not, died is more significant than recovered.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask you about.
The model that we use at UST takes into account number of cases and number of deaths. And because of the DOH ambiguity, we simply reconfigured the model so as not to take that part of the disease process into account. We took the deaths into account. Now I'm going to hand it over to Professor David because he's been doing most of our forecasting at this point, and so he can talk about the model that he's been using.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, Father Nick is correct. We don't take into account the recovered in the sense that we don't compare it to the actual number to benchmark our model. We can compare the number of cases to benchmark our model, and then the number of deaths maybe. But yung recovered, the model generally assumes the same thing, that after 2 weeks, it's recovered. And I just want to mention yung Navotas. Navotas actually had a spike in cases about 1 week ago. They averaged 141 cases per day, which is very high for a city the size of Navotas. I mean, it was actually higher than Pasig or Taguig. I mean, it was getting more cases. But as of this week, they were able to reduce it to, I think like reduction to 50% of that. So that's a big change, of course. But at the same time, it is very alarming that they experience this surge in numbers in such a small city. You would expect something.
Professor, linawin ko lang yung sa Navotas because are you seeing those numbers when you say last week or 2 weeks? Those are real-time numbers, or is there a lag reflecting to the time when they actually called for their own lockdown?
Yeah, there normally is a lag because we have some problems usually calibrating with the onset of cases in the Department of Health data. But still, we're still seeing, even with the lag and even with the backlog of cases, we're still seeing a similarity in the trend between case reports. And so.
Okay, Dr. David, how badly will we be set back if we go back to GCQ tomorrow or Wednesday?
Actually, how that will play out depends on the interventions in place that we have set up. If we could have really good interventions in place, the setback might not be like I mentioned earlier.
Yung granular lockdowns, mga ganon.
Yes, granular lockdowns, well-implemented isolation, border control, testing, random testing, and maybe some contact tracing, and then health standards being met and being observed. If we have those, it could be a lot better than the last time now we went to GCQ. Normally, from MECQ to GCQ, we expect an increase in the reproduction number. Nag-increase talaga yan once we allow people to have more mobility. So that's a given. Pero we will see how well, if they do go to GCQ, how well these interventions will work on that.
Okay, may dalawang protocols kasi na ngayon ini-impose, no, yung face shield sa lahat ng mga workers. Plus ngayon, ire-require ng maraming mga employers across several industries to have their workers undergo RT-PCR, not just the rapid test. Are these good interventions? Will they help?
So I'll take that question.
Okay.
The second one in particular is incredibly important. So the rapid antibody test has only a success rate, a sensitivity of about 20%. And that was something that the PGH reported a few weeks ago.
Right.
What that means is that we are
20%?
sending 20%.
Yes,
That's even less. That's even less than a dose point.
That's less than flipping a coin. So what that means is, using the rapid antibody test, we were sending sick workers to their jobs. And so then they would talk to their workers, they would eat in the cafeteria, and they would cough all over each other. And so not surprisingly, you're going to get spread. So the second in particular, will make a significant difference if it is strategically and efficiently implemented. Now, with regards to the shield, it's really interesting because so much of the science has focused on the mask. Because remember, the primary transmission of COVID-19 is primarily through water droplets. So some people have argued that the shield will protect your eyes from water droplets, but I have not really seen that many studies, especially those done in the United States, that suggests that shield wearing significantly increases protection over a mask, especially if the mask has three layers. So even the mask is important. If you have a single layer mask, it's not as good as a 3-layer mask. That's actually the best kind, and that's very much similar to the medical mask. So maybe if you have a 1-layer mask and a shield, it's better. But if you already are wearing a thicker mask, the studies that came out recently in the last month show that it's pretty good. It's probably as best as you can get at this point.
Yeah, I will add to that. Yes, can I add to that what Father said? Yes. Since our understanding of the virus has changed, before we're thinking the droplets are mainly projectiles. I mean, when someone sneezes or coughs and speaks, they're just showering some projectile droplets, but they will land on the floor. So if you're 2 meters away, if you just wait a few seconds, it's already on the floor. And I think we have to change the way we're understanding, because we're thinking that the virus is airborne. So what that means is they can be suspended in the air for a longer period of time, maybe hours. So that's why in closed, confined spaces, air conditioned, there's a higher risk of getting the virus. And if you're wearing, at least according to one of our doctors who are contributors to the study, if you are indoors, it's really good if you're wearing an N95 or a surgical mask. These will protect you as long as they're airtight, because droplets will not come in. If you're using a single layer cloth mask, like Father says, the holes in the cloth mask are larger than the droplets. If droplets can enter, if they're floating in the air and you're walking there, it could be coming in. And if you're wearing a face shield, it may protect you from the droplets. But I mean, I can think of a way now they can circulate around the face shield, because it's not airtight. It's just protecting yourself from projectile droplets, but it's not going to be much of a protection against floating
if it's
droplets.
floating.
I mean,
yes.
I think, yes, if it's in the air, I think you can agree that it can somehow come in, diba? But if you're wearing a face mask, it has to be airtight. The droplets won't come in. And if you're sick din naman, the droplets won't come out. That's the idea of the mask. And that's why we have to wear them, wisely and, properly.
Yes.
So delikado pa rin, sir, si Larry Gadon.
Si Larry Gadon. Mali pa rin siya.
Lalo na kasi there are a lot of people, there are quite a number of people na kung mag-isuot ng mask, nakababa sa ilong.
Yun
diba?
Pag papasok na yung droplets.
Yes. But
dito.
with all these new developments, yung face shield, yung requirement for PCR test, and after 2 weeks of MECQ, have you changed your projection for the month? Ganun pa rin ba? Until end of August?
Yeah, right now we have very rough projections. We're seeing about 230,000 by the end of August, total number of cases. If we go back to some GCQ, yes. If we retain it, we could maybe save 10 to 20,000 cases if we retain MECQ. So those are very rough projections, because I mean we want to focus on the trend. It's not just the change in numbers, but actually controlling the trend, because we don't want this pandemic to be getting out of control. And that's what happened in June, when we started going to GCQ and we relaxed, binaba natin yung guard natin, we were medyo complacent. So that's when the surge started happening under our noses. And then when we realized it was already out of hand, the hospitals are overwhelmed. So we don't want to get into that situation again. So what we do want is, if they do go to GCQ, we monitor this closely, para in case a possible surge is happening, we can possibly go back to a more strict quarantine. And I think that's one of the proposals of Father Nick, something like an alternating period of strict quarantine and looser quarantine, in case lang that we're seeing a possible uptick in numbers.
But Prof, I'm sure you read the story nung Saturday. It came out in the Manila Bulletin that it was quoting you as saying that extending the MECQ in Met Manila is not necessary.
Yes, I saw that, and it's a nice misquote from me. I don't recall saying it's not necessary. I mean, what I'm saying is MECQ is definitely. We have shown that MECQ has reduced the trend. If we continue the trend, if we continue MECQ, the trend will continue to decrease until the end of the month. Now, if they have better interventions in place, I'm more optimistic. When we do a relaxation, I'm more optimistic it will be better than compared to before. So, but we have yet to see the results of that. So, I mean, the decision is with the government, but I'm just saying if the interventions if we do relax the GCQ, the interventions have to be better. And it would give us more optimism if the interventions are better.
Okay.
All right.
Maraming salamat po for joining us
Thank you.
tonight, Professor Guido David and Father Nicanor Austriaco ng OCTA Research. Thank you very much po for joining us.
Maraming salamat po.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Parang yung rapid test, bumaba na bumaba. Nung last time kasi, it was 40 or 30%. Now it's 20%.
I think that was the day na wala kang connection, but Dr. Gap Legaspi was here, and they were sharing the insights from PGH. That was the time that
yung
they shared
lessons.
that insight.
20%.
Yes,
Oh,
20%.
and very authoritative because this is coming from the experience and data of PGH.
Yeah.
So,
I think the other hospitals, yung finding nila na yan.
That
So
really
you have
settles
better
the debate.
accuracy with the 5S coin.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
50-50 at least.
Yan ang problema.
They should really ban it. They should really ban it. Kasi it's misleading. And we're spending so much, no?
Yes.
Nagpa-rapid test ako finally nung Saturday. Kasi
antibody.
ako. Oo, test yan, yung 20%. So habang tinetest ako, kinakabahan ako, syempre, di ba? Tapos habang kinakabahan ako, sinesermonan ko yung nurse, sabi ko, alam mo, hindi man accurate yan, relax defensive.
Ano sabi sa'yo? Bakit mo pa ako pinapagod?
Ay, naku, nakakatawa. Pero yun, sabi ko, pag ako na positive dyan, gagawa ko kayong storya. Nanakot pa.
But all these companies, all these months have been relying on it because they were encouraged in a way by it.
Yes, that's right.
That's what I mean, yeah.
That's why we're saying.
Natin. Kasi akala ng mga tao, hindi sila infected eh. So,
Can you imagine all that money if that money was invested in PCR labs?
Yeah, di ba?
Well, wala na eh. Anyway,
naglalang tayo, samantalang si Lucy, nagpa-rapid test pa rin.
Oo nga.
Kasama requirement ng film development. Ano ba yung FDCP? Takot.
Mag-vote ka na lang ng face shield.
Naka-face shield din ako.
Nagmahal na.
May 20 pesos lang face shield.
From 25 sa Divisoria, naging 48 today.
Hindi, baka may lari ka doon solution yung 40 pesos.
Nakadikit sa...
May kasamang face mask. Go over na tayo.
Game na, game.
And that will be all for this Monday edition of the CHIEFS. We hope to discuss and we'll keep the conversation going. I'm Edling Galpo News.
I'm Ami Paminton of the Philippine Star.
I'm Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5.
I'm Robbie Alampay and we are One News.